Indeed. And so don't go anywhere. We're going to go right into our next keynote speaker, Dr. Kehinde Andrews. And just a little background on Dr. Andrews. Kehinde is an academic activist and author whose books include Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. His first book was Resisting Racism, Race Inequality in the Black Supplementary School Movement. Dr. Kehinde led leading the development of the Black Studies degree and is director of the Center for Critical Social Research, founder of the Harambe Organization of Black Unity, and co-chair of the Black Studies Association. He has a PhD in sociology and cultural studies. He's joined us right now. I'm just going to finish up MA in social research and a BSc in psychology. He teaches Introduction to Black Studies, City Community Culture, and Black Political Activism. His research, Dr. Kehinde is currently engaged in a project examining the role of Black radicalism in contemporary organizing against racial oppression. He is interested in supervising postgraduate research in the areas of race, ethnicity, and racism, Black studies, and how communities overcome inequality. So thank you for joining the platform. And I teach in Brooklyn, and I show some of your discussions to my students. So we're talking about you in Brooklyn.
That's good to hear. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. I'm just going to say my 4-year-old son is sitting next to me. He's doing all right, but if he starts shouting, that's what happens. But he's usually quite good, and hopefully he'll be listening as well. It's good to be at the end of the day as well, and at the end of the days. And when we're thinking about something like Pan-Africanism and where we're going in the future, I really wanted to kind of keep it, partly I want to do a bit of the problem issue, which I know we've been discussing over the last few days, but then also kind of focus on what the solution is as well, because I think that's really important. And practically, what does that mean? I've been actually just listening to Race First by Tony Martin, revisiting that book because it's come on Audible. And I strongly recommend you, if you haven't read it, pick it up again. Going back to that book just really shows you what's necessary, because actually a lot, when we're thinking about these problems, the problem isn't new, and the solution also is not new either. And really a lot of why my last book was called Back to Black, it was because we really just need to go back to a particular politics which has always been there. And the solution for our problem has always been relatively straightforward. But the problem is that how do you do it? How do you organize it? How do you get people on board? That's always been our issue, not the actual what to do. It's the how you do what needs to be done. And so I think part of that is having to explain to people what the nature of the problem is, how the nature of the problem hasn't really changed, even though it looks a bit different, and then therefore looking at what the nature of the solution is. And I think the Garvey movement is really important because, the Universal Negro Improvement Association has had its flaws, had its problems, but it was also the largest Black organization that's ever existed, with millions of members across dozens of countries. And this is in a time where there's not really even like telephone. Like, it's not like this where we're just like linked on the internet. You can just sit in your house and connect to every country in the world. There was barely even phone. You think, how does an organization like that exist when there's almost no technology to support it? Whereas now we have all the technology, but we can't get no organization. And really the key thing is, in the UNA starts in like the early 20th century. Its peak is like 1920s. And the key is, in 1920, if you went to any Black person in any part of the world and said, do you feel part of this? Do you think that the West or this economic system can provide for you? Everybody would have said no, right? Like they weren't part of it. We were not part of it. We weren't in it. We were in it, but very, 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 very clearly discriminated, and so clearly discriminated that very few people were mad enough to believe that there was any way that we could ever get freedom and justice and equality in this system. And that's the biggest difference now. where there's so many people now that you have to convince people that we're properly discriminated against in that same way. You have to spend most of your time convincing people that in the first place. And that's the big shift. So we have the technology, but because we have the technology, we've confused ourselves into thinking that we're somehow on a better track. So I got some slides which is basically those pictures, so you don't just have to look at me for the next few minutes. But I think that's the kind of the arc of this talk, just to say, like, how do you explain to people the problem, and then from that, how do you explain to people the solution? These two things are very, 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 very much tied together. Yeah, I'm going to try and share this. Nope. Try. All right, I'm going to share. Hang on a second. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Hopefully you can see that. There it is. I can see it. So you must be able to see it. Let me make it bigger. Yeah, I'm gonna assume. No one says it's not working. I'm gonna assume it. I'm gonna assume it's working, and just keep going. So, yeah, the new age of colonialism, which is a riff on the last book I just wrote, The New Age of Empire. With empire, colonialism, they're all kind of the same, right? The key thing I wanted to point out, because I do this actually in Back to Black more than in the last book, was this concept of the Negro, because it's just such an important idea, which Cedric Robertson in Black Marxism really calls into account, where he says, well, actually, if you think about what is one of the most important commodities for the advancement of capitalism, it is the creation of the Negro, right? Like, and this is where, when we think about racism and in debates about racism, and I have a lot of debates about racism, and we're just talking nonsense in most of these debates. When you think about racism, it isn't about whether people don't like me because I'm black, or, you know, if I'm going to get abuse in the street and all that stuff. That's a level of prejudice which comes from obviously racism. But racism is, and white supremacy is, it is the economic, it is that economic structuring, right? It is how we are placed in the hierarchy of things. And the creation of the Negro is absolutely essential to capitalism. Can't work. Capitalism just can't happen, right? Without the so-called Atlantic system, which is basically slavery. If you think about the key commodities, sugar, first it's actually gold, silver, then tobacco, then sugar, then cotton. They're all growing in the Americas. They're all done by slave labor. That is absolutely essential. And they needed the workforce to do it. And that was us, right? Africans. And so they created us as the Negro, right? And this is a really important concept to think about, because you have to think about how much has this really changed, right? So the Negro is someone who has no history, no culture, who is not a human being, who is more cattle, is more like an animal than a person. And by doing that, they were able to exploit us. They were justify our exploitation, put us on slave plantations, etc., go into Africa and colonize the continent, etc., etc. And so that idea of the Negro is you can't have capitalism without the Negro. Like, absolutely essential. See, these are some of the. I was in Brazil a few years ago, and there's a great museum there where you can see some of the, some of the remnants of this historically. Again, when we think about this historically, the really important thing to do is think about how much that has changed today. The case I always use as the kind of perfect example of what that status of Negro means is the Zong case in the UK, which you might be familiar with. There's a really terrible movie called Bell, which was about Bell Dido, who was like literally the one enslaved African who grew up in a mansion house in England. And I don't recommend watching it. But anyway, it touches on this Zong case. And the Zong case was a slave ship in the 1770s that, in 1781, that came into trouble because it ran out of water. And what they did was they threw the Africans overboard, basically to save the ship, right? Now, this is really important because that wasn't uncommon during slavery. And this case came to court, but the case came to court as an insurance case, right? The question simply was, could the slave ship captain claim his insurance because his cargo, 132 Africans, were spoiled because of the journey, etc., and therefore could he claim insurance? That was it. That was the status that we had in English courts at that time. And Lord Mansfield, who's the Chief Justice at the time, makes it very, very clear in his ruling. He says the case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. The question was whether there was an absolute necessity for throwing them over the board to save the rest, right? So the question basically came down to, was the ship in trouble because of the captain not sailing properly, or was the ship in trouble because of some other reason which you could claim insurance for? So that's that. This is the British Empire. This is the largest empire in human history. This is the country that's enslaved the most, that the ships enslaved the most Africans. Didn't actually, most Africans were enslaved, ended up in Brazil, and that was our status, right? The Negro. That's Negro status. Again, you really need to think about how much things have changed from then to now, especially when you think about in the UK, particularly in Europe, we're having this whole debate about the migrant crisis, so-called migrant crisis across the Mediterranean, which came to light, it came into the news mostly because of Syrian refugees, but actually is predominantly about African migration, and actually West Africans who are economic migrants leaving places because of poverty, going across Libya, the Sahara Desert through Libya, and then getting on boats to come. And it's been happening for a long time. And the solution now basically is just to let people drown, right? Literally, let's let them drown, and then they'll stop coming, right? And think about the parallels that has to Zong, where there is just no respect for our life. Our life is essentially meaningless, right? So, allied very clearly to this idea of the Negro is race, right? And again, when we think about race, it isn't about the individual; it's about structural. And I always use this quote from Linnaeus because it's perfect. Enlightenment botanist in the 18th century, Enlightenment botanist in the 18th century, who was doing a book where he was looking at all the plants. And in this book, he also did people, right? And says, Europes albus, ingenious, white, sanguine, governed by law. Americus rubescus is, so that's the top. Americus rubescus, happy with his liberty-loving, tanned and irascible is the next stage of human being. They're governed by custom. Then you have Asiatic luridus, who's yellow, melancholy, governed by opinion, as a third rung of the ladder. And at the very bottom, you have Afro-Niger, crafty, lazy, black, governed by the arbitrary will of the master. And that's white supremacy in a nutshell, right? Black at the bottom, white at the top, and everything else in between. So we can be treated the worst, we can be enslaved, we can be, nations can be colonized, all in the pursuit of white supremacy. And really importantly, again, I stress this is not something that's in the past. And the picture I always use to show this is a map of global inequality of wealth by GDP, right? So the blue countries are the richest countries, America, North America, Western Europe, Japan's an outlier, as is some of the Middle East because of oil, and Australia. But when he showed this to, and I actually do this, I go to schools and show this to kids, and you say, "Oh, look, what are the blue countries got in common, and what do the poorest countries of the red?" You'll see in so-called sub-Saharan Africa, there's a deep concentration of red. What do the poorest countries have in common? And they can see it, right? It's blatantly obvious. The places where the black people live, so-called sub-Saharan Africa, it's very, very poor, by money at least. The places where the white people live, Western Europe, America, Australia, etc., very, very rich, right? It's obvious. It's blindingly obvious. And this is today. But actually, white supremacy, that ladder, it isn't a coincidence that exists, right? It didn't just randomly happen that the image of white supremacy from the 18th century thinkers is the image of the world today. And the implications of this are, and I should have got this, and I do, I probably in the future won't use wealth, but if you use life expectancy, it's exactly the same map, right? So this is actually life and death. When we say Black Lives Matter, this is what we are talking about. Black lives actually do not matter in our political economy. Because if you're in these dark red countries, you are far more likely to die far earlier. In fact, I was reading something, one of the most insane statistics I ever read was about life expectancy in Sudan, and how a child born today has more chance of dying by their 5th birthday than an American soldier had dying in the Vietnamese War, right? That's the reality that we're talking about. Like it is literally, it is insane, right? We just had lockdowns and panic about COVID-19 because white people were being killed by the hundreds of thousands. More people will die in 1 year from poverty than will die from COVID-19 at all. 9 million people every year die from poverty. Almost all of them, and pretty much all of them, live in the underdeveloped world, right? every year, and then we don't care about it, we don't think about it, we don't even discuss it, right? That's today. So when we're talking about the new age of colonialism, it's the same thing. It's just run differently, right? And what's really fascinating is if you think about this whole paradigm of global inequality, and you think about the organization that's supposed to deal with global inequality is the United Nations, right? We'll go on the United Nations website and find racism, white supremacy, any of that in their explanation of how the world looks this way. They don't exist. They're not there. We don't talk about it at all. We talk about global inequality, and there is no recognition that the biggest by far explainer of global inequality is white supremacy, right? And then if you can open the door. Then if you go and think about, sorry, my son is literally about to go back behind me, but I will carry on. Then if you think about in country as well, and so we look at someone like the United States, look at UK, you look at anywhere where we are, you look at South America, where we are minorities in white countries, you see the same things get played out. Why would you be surprised? Why would you be surprised in a system that literally lives off the death of black and brown people, that black and brown people within rich countries are doing much worse than their white counterparts? It's obvious. It's the logic of the system, right? Now, really important when we think about this and the shift and why it's maintained and why I call it the new age of empire is, I use a Malcolm X quote, and I always use Malcolm X quotes, and there's a couple coming up later. But Malcolm talks about how there is a major shift in the in post Second World War. So up to the Second World War, you have lots of overt violence, control. It's European nation state led. British Empire, French Empire, it's slavery, there's formal colonialism. But after the Second World War, this can't hold anymore. It starts to collapse because lots of reasons are us. We're fighting back, saying, no, we're not going to take this anymore. We're declaring our independence. We're saying we're not going to have this anymore. The wars have really depleted Europe anyway. America is, you think about America is just Europe on steroids. It is a place where Europeans went and committed absolute barbarity without any checks and balances on them. And so America was kind of always going to be the ascendancy, right? The pinnacle of the pinnacle of white supremacy. So this is starting to happen, right? And so after the Second World War, you have this shift, and Malcolm explains how, the European powers were kind of stuck. They were broke. They had independence movements. They couldn't manage the colonies. And so the whole system was in danger of collapse. And he likens it to basketball, where if you're trapped and you're playing basketball and you get trapped, you pass the ball, right? You swing it out to your open teammate, and the open teammate was America. So the center shifts away from Europe and it shifts over to America. And this is logical. It makes sense given everything else. And America presents itself as what Malcolm saw as benevolent colonialism, right? America is a revolutionary country, right? Freed itself from colonialism of the UK. America is the leader of the free world. America has different values, etc., etc. And so this is supposed to be like a new age, right? No European empires, no, everything's totally different. And what you get rather than European nation state led is you get the creation of things like the United States, International Monetary Fund, World Bank. They're all at the same time, in the same place, by the same people. We're saying, actually, how are we going to run the global economy and the global politics? And the only thing we really get out of this is we get a pretense that we're free, right? So we get our countries back politically in some senses, right? You can vote, you get independence is granted mostly and not won. It is won in many places, but often the Queen just turns up and says, look, here's your country. And that's for a reason, right? Because we're able to operate within a particular confines of nation states, which have been defined not by us, but by Europe. In fact, look at the map and see Africa, even at this distance, you can tell you shouldn't have lots of straight lines on a map, right? Straight lines tell you something's gone really, 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 really wrong in the planning of that map. And so we have the pretense that things have changed. We have, movements to eradicate racism. We have the ideas of equality start to happen in the 60s, etc. And we have this pretense that we're getting better. But actually, if you actually look at the underlying logic of it, the economics of it, it doesn't change at all. Like not even slightly, right? There's the logic of exploitation of the West is about black and brown life is disposable in terms of exploiting labor, which is what slavery was about, right? Exploit labor. And exploiting resources of land, which is what colonialism is largely about, right? Africa being the richest country by mineral wealth, but somehow the poorest country, the richest continent by mineral wealth, but somehow the poorest continent by actual money, infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. Right? And that hasn't changed at all, right? There is a reason why we've offshored jobs to the third world, right? Because you can pay people wages that could never exist, or could only exist in prisons in America, but couldn't exist in the West, right? There's a reason why we're able to even have this conversation, right? Because our laptops and stuff are this coltan and things which are mined and literally stripped out of the African continent, and then the computers are put together by sweatshop workers in Asia, right? So the logic of it is the same, and the reality of it is the same, and death of it is the same, right? So we don't think about those 9 million deaths per year due to poverty as the result of racism. But what on earth else are they the result of? That is like a child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got proper access to food and water. That's because of racism. That's just the same because of racism as when slave hunters would go and kill people trying to capture them, right? It's just the same as when you're hacking off people's in Belgium, they're hacking off people's limbs because they're not getting a rubber quota. It's not as direct, but the font of it, the reason for it happening is exactly the same, right? And we should think about it in exactly the same way, right? Now, importantly, because I want to be positive, not just negative, it's all bad, and hopefully, if you're here, I guess you would accept that it's all bad, right? But the problem is the same, and I said before, the solution is also the same, right? It hasn't really changed. And the concept I always use, blackness, we do black studies, black radicalism, black everything, right? All black everything. And it's that because it gives us such an important connection to each other and to ourselves, right? That kind of goes beyond the rational and goes into it's about, how do we see ourselves? Where are we going forward with this, right? And so I give Garvey, I was thinking, I'm listening again to Brace First. So Garvey's on my mind a lot there. But this idea that the black symbol is not a symbol of shame, but rather a glorious symbol of greatness is so important. And again, it's even still important. Like we can kind of imagine it in the 20s, this was massively important because it's particularly slavery, but colonialism, it was so total, right? That, we didn't have black directors making movies on Netflix. Like you didn't have anything, like you just had white stuff all the time everywhere, right? So there was a constant assault. And so you can see how that's really, 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 really important in the 20s and in Malcolm's day, in the Black Power movement, etc., etc. But it's also still really important, right? Because there's still so much anti-blackness going on, even though you have some kind of representation. And you have to question a lot of that representation anyway, but that's a whole other story. But this idea of blackness, and not just blackness as a symbol of look, black joy and black excellence and all that, but no, blackness as a political idea, right? Blackness as we are connected to each other and we rely and we depend on each other and we are responsible to each other. You're not seeing that a lot on Netflix when you go. You're not getting that kind of revolutionary concept of blackness, right? So Malcolm says there's a new type of Negro who calls themselves black. Right, who embraces that blackness, who embraces their color, because this is the thing with us because of slavery, right? Because it displaced so many of us. It is kind of the only thing that we have that connects us back to. I can't tell you where my original roots are. I can't, my family's via Jamaica predominantly, and that's lost, right? But what I can, but the color of my skin, the kink of my hair, that's important because it connects me to not just a past, but to a present. It connects me to all people who are black across the globe, right? And that's the kind of blackness that we should be engaging in and thinking in. That's the kind of revolutionary blackness which ties us all together. This says so when we, and this is not what most black politics does, right? Most black politics is the opposite of this. In fact, it says, look, what can we get here? Like, how can we get? I'm a professor. It's nice for me, but getting more black professors ain't a solution to nothing. That is not that's only a solution if I think that my community is black people in the UK. And I say, well, how do we get it better for black people in the UK? But that's not revolutionary blackness. Revolutionary concept of blackness is about saying that we are responsible for all black people, the least of us. And the wretched of the earth are predominantly black, right? And they don't live here. They're not in the UK. They probably are actually. Parts of America is terrible that they actually probably are in America. And parts of Latin America certainly is so terrible. But when you see the conditions that people live in, and many people live in, not all people live in certainly, but many people living on the African continent, you are seeing a different scale, right? Like I say, different scale. And we should be, and the reason that blackness is a revolutionary concept is because it connects us to everyone. It connects us to the kids in Congo who are picking the coltan out of the mines and says, well, actually, this is our radical community. And we have to, if we're going to solve the problems, we have to solve the problems for everyone. And when you take it on that level, then you can only come up with revolutionary argument. You can't come up with anything other than revolution to solve those problems, right? So it stops us thinking in that narrow kind of how do we get on, and it makes us think about how do we actually change the whole entire system, right? So again, I said I was going to use Malcolm quotes, so it might probably be more later on. It says if you're black, you should be thinking black, and if you're not thinking black at this late stage, then I'm sorry for you, right? That was 50 years, more than 50 years ago at this point. And just saying that this idea of black consciousness, this idea of thinking black is so important to how we go forward. It's the most important first thing, because once you have that, once you think black, then you have to think differently. Then you're going to do things differently. Then we're going to be able to change things, right? But that black consciousness is the first point. And just to stress that, again, this isn't a new thing, right? This isn't a new thing at all. This has gone through our history in many versions, particularly in the resistance to slavery, right? Because what was slavery was trying to create the Negro, but couldn't do it, right? Because we're people, we're human. We have culture. The Negro isn't a real thing. It doesn't actually exist, right? It exists only in the minds of whites, right? And we're not just white people, but people who embrace white supremacy, right? And so it was never possible. And so you can see that I picked out Brazil as a perfect example, because Palmares was so vast, a Quilombo or a Maroon community of runaways in Brazil. It was so vast that you could actually argue that Palmeiras or Angola Janga is the first Black republic. It lasted for 80 years. It had a system of laws and governance. The Portuguese, it took them years and years to take it down, right? And what that was, and how it happened, and why it happened, was because of the deep connections to ourselves, to our continent, and not letting them go, right? To traditional beliefs, to traditional practices, to the ideas of us as a community, and then fleeing to make a community, right? And actually building an actual community. And you can see that through Maroon communities across anywhere there was enslaved. There were communities of Maroons and runaways doing things differently, building things differently, keeping those connections. And those connections, if you go across the formerly enslaved, are still there, right? They're still very much there in many ways, right? The example that's often cited, and is a good example of this, is the Haitian Revolution, right? 1791 to 1804. They found the first in constitution terms, written terms, first Black Republic, right? They're very clear about this as well. They're very clear. They say, look, this is a Black Republic. And it started with a voodoo ceremony. It's not coincidental that the traditional beliefs which starts this. Bookman and Cecile Fatiman are pictured here in Bois Cayman leading the ceremony that kicks off the Haitian Revolution. It's not an accident, right? In fact, one of the reasons Haiti is cited as being the place that kicks off the revolution, it has a revolution, successful slave rebellion, is because there were so many African born of the enslaved, because the French just worked us to death on the island, and then just replaced it. So there's so many African born on the island who had those connections, had those roots, who actually were people had societies. There was actually warriors who were taken into slavery, and they're coming onto the plantation saying, look, we're not taking this, and we're gonna rebel. Really important. If you read C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, which is excellent text on this, one of the reasons it takes so long for this revolution to actually happen, to not happen, but to be completed, is because everybody doesn't get to Black consciousness at the same time, right? The enslaved get to Black consciousness early. They know, they get it. They're like, look, we need to end this, and we need to burn down the plantation. You also then had a group in Haiti of mulattoes. Mulatto is a terrible word, which we really shouldn't use, but this is the word that was used of these people at the time, right? A mixed community who had some privileges on the island, who were kind of used as a buffer class between the enslaved and trying to keep them in check. And they didn't really want to get involved at first. And then you also had some free Africans. And in fact, Toussaint Louverture was free at the time of the revolution, right? And wasn't really wasn't in it. They weren't really in it at first, and they only really came in, and it only really succeeded as a revolution when everybody came in it. And it really only, and the mulattoes and the free Negroes only really came into it when they didn't have a choice, right? When the enslaved just took it and started burning things and said, you're with us or against us. But eventually that meant that that everybody joined in. And when everybody joined in, that was when you had the revolution. This is such an important concept for us now, right? Because we're so I mean, this is I don't want to say it's the worst time we've been in terms of dissolution, but we're certainly a one of the worst times anyway. But yeah, so declare the Free Black Republic was successful, but then you also get the other side of that, where Haiti is now one of the poorest countries in the world because of its revolution, deeply punished for this afterwards, right? The fact that there wasn't, they didn't get catch a contagion and go through to Dominican Republic, to Jamaica, to the rest of the Caribbean, to the Americas, to Latin America, meant that they were stuck, right? And this is something, again, we have to think. Revolution in one country is not revolution, really, because it just ends, right? We have to have all of us. It has to be connected, which is deeply important. All right, I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because I might skip some. Yeah, so I really want to stress this idea of Black consciousness, because this is the solution to our problem. Black consciousness has always been the solution to our problem. Like, honestly, if all of us thought black in a way, in a political way, I don't mean a cultural way, I don't mean like a spiritual way, I don't mean like a general black people a good way, like politically thought black in a sense that we are responsible to each other. Africa and the African diaspora, we are connected. We need each other, and we must relate to each other, and we must build a politics that has all of us in it. That is the solution to our problem. And you can hear slogans like Africa, and this is even prior to, I used the Dahir al-Qaeda in the 7th century with a call for Africa for the Africans. Even prior to, like, North Africa is certainly part of Africa, and was a part of Africa where, you know, in the 7th century, Arabs came in and came in with racist ideas and dominated and took over. And that's why North Africa looks like it looks now, and came in with some very problematic ideas the Europeans picked up. So this idea of Black consciousness isn't even just related to Europe, right? And that's really important. It's not just Europeans who have these ideas. In fact, Europeans don't really have any new ideas. They just tend to regurgitate other people's ideas and pretend that they're new. And racism is actually one of those very, very things. That I can go into that in more detail if you want. And there was, I want to stress here, there was fierce resistance to slavery on the continent, right? Like, what a massive resistance. In fact, if you actually look historically, we had those big castles like Elmina. There's a reason that they're so well protected and we're so well fortified, right? Because Africans are not just saying, yeah, go and take the people. But it even gets to the point where the castles aren't enough, and they start docking ships just off the coast, and then just keeping people, and then they go in and then they just fill up the ships and put people on the boat because they couldn't even be on the mainland for too long, right? So there was fierce resistance. But the sad truth is that had we had Black consciousness on the African continent in, I don't know, the 15th century, even by the 16th century, 17th century, then slavery couldn't happen. Like, it literally couldn't happen. Like, the biggest myth that the West, the white people will tell you, Europeans will tell you, is that it's because of advancement, because Europe was more advanced, that Europe was able to take over. Not really true. In 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, they weren't really advanced. They were behind. They were behind basically everybody. Right? Africans had already made it to the Americas and back. This wasn't a new thing for Africans to find out there's the Americas. There's a reason why most countries in Africa are colonized for less than 100 years. So colonization really takes place later. Slavery depletes the African continent to the point where they can actually then come in and start doing slavery. And without slavery, we don't have that slavery bit first, which totally destroys Africa political economy. The Europeans don't have the capacity to colonialize. If the wealth they generate from enslavement isn't there to give them the guns and the infrastructure to come, they can't colonize the rest of the world. So actually, at the point in which they're coming in, they're behind. And if they were able to, play us up against each other, use it against each other, they certainly had guns and things like this, and there's lots of technological reasons, etc. But there is absolutely no doubt that had Africa responded as Africa, the Europe slavery couldn't have happened, right? And that is a sad fact to understand, and it's something we have to appreciate, because the same is true today. If Africa and the diaspora responded as one, as Africa and the diaspora, you couldn't have these things. You couldn't have it wouldn't happen even now. And that's the thing we've never really got right. Never really fully picked up. All right, I'm gonna skip a couple of them. I'm not gonna skip this one because I think these last two actually really important. When we're thinking about this idea of Pan-Africanism, and again, just go and read Race First again, or listen to it if you have a chance. This idea of Pan-Africanism look, Pan-Africanism will be good, but Pan-Africanism can be terrible as well. Like the first 4 Pan-African congresses led by Du Bois, they're not radical at all. Like the zero like they're actually more like social clubs for the elite, talented 10th. They're very much about how do we work with the colonizers to get a bit more from them. They're in complete opposition to the Garvey movement. And the Garvey movement are organizing universal conventions with lots of people, and the masses are coming to them. And at the same time, you have the Pan-African Congress movement, which is utterly opposed to and against the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and disparaging all of the even terms like Africa for the Africans, disparaging the black masses. And if you think about where Pan-Africanism is now, that formal version of Pan-Africanism, we still have that. It's called the African Union. Like it really is called the African Union. African Union is a Pan-African thing. It has its history and legacy. You can trace back almost directly to the Pan-African Congress movement, which is bourgeois, deeply negative and deeply reactionary, right? So when we're saying Pan-African, we have to be very clear what we mean by Pan-Africanism, right? Because in many ways, like we think about someone like Garvey as Pan-African, but not really. At the time, the Pan-African thing was this one thing, and Garvey was this thing, and they were very, 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 very different. And intellectually, we need to be much clearer and much sharper when we do this, because I love Malcolm to the core, but one of the problems that you actually see with Malcolm's work and things like is the organization African Unity when he dies, the organization African Unity, which becomes the African Union. There is this kind of idea that, look, if we can get us all together, if we can get us all around the table, then we're going to be okay. Which isn't really true. A lot of us don't need to be at the table. Like unity, like as much as I said that black consciousness is important, you have to accept that everybody doesn't have black consciousness, and the people who don't have black consciousness don't need to be at the table. Like you just can't. We can't spend all our time trying to convince people without black consciousness to have black consciousness. We just gotta do what is necessary, and not make compromises. Right? If you start making compromises, then it starts to get problematic. So there's a couple of quotes here about just like Sekou Touré, for example, who's a Pan-African figure. At the time in the 60s, who's, there was a lot of objection to the idea of black consciousness, right? Saying things like negative, saying things like black power negative, because it's the same. Saying black together is the same as saying white together. There's no, drop that completely, right? There is this idea that the national sovereignty is important, right? Like that you need to have Ghana, you need to have South Africa, you need to have Kenya. No, those are made up countries. That is probably the biggest barrier to unity across the continent, is these made up countries that we're still imposed in, right? We're stuck in national liberation. And really the death knell of the organization African Unity in '62 was the idea that you could of sovereignty, non-interference in the internal affairs of individual states, which just says, look, you can't have that kind of unity that we need, right? So when we're thinking about the kind of unity that we need, it really is the conception of the global black nation, on a very real front. And this is what makes the UNA really special, right? There are many other problems with the UNA in many ways, organizationally, in terms of all the downfall, etc. But on the basic point, they got it exactly correct, which was that we need to think of ourselves as a nation, and not a nation within a nation, not like just simply as there's black people in America, black people who are, no, an actual nation, a global nation, right? Where we're all connected, we're all responsible to each other, and we don't like people say to me, "Are you British?" all the time. I say, "I'm not British. I'm not. I have a passport in Britain. I live in Britain, but I'm black, right? And black is the country which I feel affinity to is us, and that's important. Like not just to say it, because at the minute all you can do is really say it. But what we should be doing is trying to build that, and that's what the UNA tried to do, right? So with those millions of members, they had ambassadors, they had president, they had at the time people were mocking, but was actually really important conceptually, because we should be thinking in those terms. How do we build that organization that practically links us all together, that builds us all together, that gives us the tools so that we can respond, work together, build together, and grow together? That's the solution. There's a simple, very, very, like I said, this is not a new thing. This is not a new thing in any way, shape, or form. This was a solution back then. It's a solution now. We just have to understand that this is a solution, because we need to understand that the problem hasn't changed one small, even slight bit. and we'll be in a much better place. So like that's why I'm happy to see what's happening here and happy to see what's happened over the last few days, because it is these kind of things which should connect us together. It's these kind of platforms that we need in order to build the infrastructure that we need, right? Because we just don't have that infrastructure. Without the infrastructure, we will perish. Like Garvey said, you will perish without it. We will perish. But it's always possible. And I'll end on this because we're positive. It's more possible now than it has ever been because we actually have the technology to do it, right? The thing that's stopping us from doing it is that we don't think black. And all we need to do is start thinking black and using these tools that we now have, and then we will be able to build the revolutionary movement that is necessary. And I will stop there.
Right. Thank you for that presentation. Powerful presentation. And just going to look in the chat and raise a couple of questions. I saw one so far, but this is from Jody. The question is, do you think the current movement challenging our collectively defining ourselves as black is being funded? Let me ask that again just for myself. Do you think the current movement challenging our collectively defining ourselves as black is being funded?
Yeah, I get the question. I think like it's so
got it.
Yeah. So this question about like this idea of people not liking black is long standing and it's different contexts. And it probably is partly being funded. Like I wouldn't even be surprised if a lot of it is being funded by agents and people who don't have a best interest at heart, to be honest. But it is a completely ridiculous conversation. I mean, like when I say black, I mean African. Like, there's a reason that these two things they're not really distinguishable in many ways. The only real difference is that when we say black, we recognize that black is a politics, right? It's a politics, and that says that has a very radical root to it. As I said, like all across the diaspora, etc. It connects diaspora to the continent. It has a history to it. It's also our term as well. The idea that people just call black it's not true. We embrace that and take that on ourselves, right? And there's a deep misunderstanding, and this is a deep misunderstanding that race and blackness are the same thing. So when white people have this conception of race, that is not blackness. Like that, blackness is a rejection of race. Blackness is us coming together and saying, look, we're not doing this. We're recognizing our color is important. It's important so that we organize and resist and revolt. And you can see that constantly through history. So people have a problem with black. They just don't understand the history, unfortunately. It's a deep conceptual mistake. And I tried to emphasize in the presentation, blackness isn't just for us. It often sounds like it's just for us in the diaspora who don't know our African roots, etc. But it isn't. Blackness is just as important on the African continent. Like it's more important, just as important, both analytically. So because there's Africa is predominantly black, and I went to Nigeria just before COVID, and there's like you see like 3 white people. There's like barely any white people in Nigeria. But if you look at the problems, you can see that just because there's no white people actually there doesn't mean it's not white supremacy that's causing these problems. When you look at the poverty that's there, it's so abject, the poverty, and rather than just looking at the actual problem, which is that Europeans and Americans and increasingly Chinese own all of the resources and strip the resources, and that's why people are poor, otherwise known as white supremacy, right? We're saying, oh no, it's the corrupt leaders, things like that. We're blaming ourselves. We're saying, look, definitely there's plenty of corrupt leaders in somewhere like Nigeria, but who's corrupted them? Where are they getting their money from, and where's the money going? That's white supremacy, right? All of that is white supremacy. So if we don't see that white supremacy is equally at work in Nigeria as it is in America, then we've completely and utterly missed the point, right? So it's important analytically, and then it's important also in terms of black consciousness, right? To see yourselves, to understand that this is because we're black, and that these problems here in Nigeria that we're seeing are the same as the problems in Jamaica, same as the problems in Brazil, same as the problems in America, etc. Massively important analytically. So no, blackness is the most important concept in terms of consciousness, and I don't know if it's being funded, but I wouldn't be surprised if the kind of let's not call ourselves black thing is being funded, because it is such an important concept for our liberation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And if anyone else has any questions, type it in the chat. I agree with something that you raised in regards to black using black in a political way, and developing this black consciousness, not just as a sort of like a cultural or it's another a term you use, but definitely I think like historically we have developed this idea of blackness and using it in a political way, and you give them Garvey and Malcolm X as examples. Steve Biko is another example, right? He talks about black consciousness. When you talk about black consciousness, is it in the same way that Steve Biko is something like a movement, the movement that he was attempting to, well, I'm not attempting because he was a part of the black consciousness movement, but is it similar to that movement that took place in Occupy Tanzania?
There's similarities and differences because the national situation in South Africa is unique in some senses, right? Where you have so clear apartheid, and so clear divisions of white and then everybody else. And so actually Biko is often used against black consciousness in African sense. When I say black consciousness, I mean in African sense. It's really important for us. And probably is more similar in the South African context to the Africanization, Pan-African Congress movement in South Africa. And again, I want to stress that Biko is not against African unity at all. Like Biko is 100% not against it. But in the Tanzania situation, what he's saying is that there is also this issue that we just need to get rid of apartheid and get rid of white people. And in that sense, then black then encompasses everybody who's not white, right? But this is not against. But in the South African context, the kind of blackness I'm talking about is more the Africanization, which Biko's not against. He's just saying, look, these two things in this particular context need to go together. And I think people misread that all the time, right? Because it is important that we hold on to blackness as African, like it's connected to African. But in that particular context, it's not that important because you can say African Union, you can say African ANC, you can say African in a way that you can't. It's more difficult in the West, right? So similarities but differences, I'd say, with Biko.
Okay, I have another question from Anonymous. Well, just a follow-up question. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to the development of black consciousness used as a political tool, and what should we do to counter, that obstacle or those obstacles?
So I think, well, there's two. One is more difficult to do anything about than the other. So, like, one of them is simply material, right? So, if you think about what's happened over the last 40 years, technological advances has meant that, particularly in the West, we have access to things like, mobile phones. Even across Africa, you have things like mobile phones, you have TV, we have more access to things we wouldn't have had in the 60s, right? So in the 60s, it's bleak and people know it's bleak, but now you kind of feel like you're more connected because you can have more things, you can have more of those trappings, etc., etc. And then also, because of things like independence movements and because of racial relations legislation, you do have a much larger middle class than you had prior, right? Like, I'm a professor. Like in the 60s in the UK, I would not be a professor, no, like not with my family's heritage coming from like rural Jamaica, right? So that's meant that for many of us, not all of us certainly, but for many of us in the West at least, and for the elites on the African continent, and for the growing middle class in the African continent, we're actually doing relatively okay, right? So when people are doing relatively okay, they're not really going to be saying, let's have a revolution. Let's like, on a personal level, does it make material sense for me to feel connected to the young boy in the Congo picking out coltan? Not really, right? I'm benefiting from it. I benefit from it in the same way that white people benefit from it, right? So there's that material thing where now we actually are in the house in a way that in the 20s we weren't in the house, or in the 60s we weren't in the house, and many of us aren't in the house now. But there's a number of us who are in the house, and so don't want to rock the boat, right? Now there's not that much we can do about that one, but the thing we can do about it is because of that, and this is where you just get Malcolm quotes from me, basically. When Malcolm's talking about hash Negro, field Negro, he is talking about hash Negro, field Negro in a kind of material sense, right? Like there's middle class people, etc. But it's more important talking about it as a mentality, right? Like because you are in that position, because I'm in the position I am in, it is far more likely I'm going to be reactionary just because I'm comfortable, right? But I don't have to be reactionary. And this is what he's trying to remind us that even though I'm relatively comfortable, I still experience racism. I got 3 male sons. I mean, geez, like they're not just because I'm a professor, it don't mean they're protected from all the other racism that everybody else sees, or even I'm protected from racism in my job, right? So he's reminding us that actually you're still black, and saying that just because you're in those positions doesn't mean you have to think with the house Negro mentality. You can still think black. And so the thing that we need to do, and the thing for me, so when I wrote Back to Black, I was like, look, this is a platform for the Black Revolution, and I thought it'd be easier, like just give it to Black people, let them read it. They'd be like, okay, that makes sense. I thought that would be easier, but actually the pushback was that people just don't know, right? People don't understand what white supremacy is. And it's not a surprise because we all grow up with colonial systems of education, as much here as in the continent, or we grow up with television that's just bad for our minds. Like if you literally look, how would people know the state of the black world and what's caused it? Black people are not more likely to know this than white people. So the real thing is just to tell people like they don't know. Like, and in this, if you look at the 60s and 70s, and even like a Negro world, why was the God movement so popular? It was a Negro world because it had publications, people could read it, and people could learn about stuff. Education for our community, and I want to stress this, I don't mean education for white people, that is not exclusive to anything, but education for our community, that was the core, has always been the core of radical movements, where we're educating us to know that things need to radically shift, and that has to come back. So in the UK, we used to have a much stronger like Black Power education movement with like bookshops, what we call Saturday schools, where people would take their kids at the weekend, community meetings and organizations. It's just like it was harder to not know, whereas now it's easy not to know, right? So we need to really build in those educational mechanisms so that we can. That's what education liberation means. Because if we go back to that, when we can do that on a global scale, then we're going to be in the right mindset to do what needs to be done. I think.
All right, thank you for that. There's a question coming from someone that's anonymous. He or she says, in 3 to 5 years, what developments would you like to have seen in our movements? Anything specific?
Yeah, so and I think about this a lot, right? So like I would really like to see an actual, and I don't want to call it a Pan-African Congress because I think just being reminded of how terrible some of that is, but like the idea that we have like something like this, right? But in person, that's built over 3 years, where I would love to see is say, well, look, let's set a date at like 25 or something like that. And actually 2025 is Malcolm's 100th birthday. So maybe that's a good year to do it. Where we said, let's set a date, we'll find a place on the African continent, we'll say we're gonna lead to this date. And in the intervening 3 years, we're gonna spend a year where we just organize locally. Because look, I organize in Britain, I live in Birmingham, and I'm surprised sometimes when I hear what's happening in Birmingham. Like we don't even have it at that level where we just know what's happening on a basic thing, like who's doing what's going on, etc. What are the movements and what are people engaged in? Then the next year you organize nationally. So we say, look, we're in Britain, we've got this. We bring everybody together, we make those connections, and then you spend the next year building those connections for the whatever you want to call it, in convention of the African peoples of the world, but because we spent 3 years doing it, it's like organic, it's legitimate. We've got connections with each other, and we're properly building it. So when we get to that 3 year period, it's not just a meeting where we're just having discussions. It's actually a planning thing. It's a thing where we know where we're going. It's a thing where we know we're developing. I would love to see that happen. In fact, I'm saying I love to see it. I'm gonna try and make it happen. So I think that is something that we just need to do, right? Because because this I want as lots of other things I'd like to see, but I think that's really important as a starting point, but then building where we can really take it forward. If you want to have a global Black nation, then we need to build a global Black nation, and that would be a good starting point for me.
Hey, it sounds like we need to be building together for that one.
100%. Let's just do it. Let's just say we're gonna do it and then do it. That's how things happen, right?
Indeed, yes. Another question. This is coming from Evelyn Reynolds. The question is, can you talk about the cultural and structural revolution that needs to occur and how we can engage with both at the same time?
Look, culture is important. Like, it's massively important, and they think about education, and education is part of that, right? And I think that the key thing to do is to build, and it's about building alternatives. And I think once you start to build alternatives, you get alternative cultures in there. So, for instance, like if we're saying the schools don't work, right? Let's build a Black school. And if you say we're going to build a black school, then you got to think, what does that mean? Like, how does that work? That's going to look different culturally, right? It's going to have different ways of being. And I think that's where I get with culture. Sometimes that's where I get a bit like it isn't the case that you change your culture and then that changes things. What the actual case is, you start doing revolutionary things and the culture will automatically change because you're in the process of doing revolutionary things. So to get a revolutionary culture, the only way to do that is to be involved in the process of revolution. And the key thing for us, it really is these alternative institutions, alternative organizations, alternative everything. And when we do that, you have to then build an alternative culture. And also culture is really important in terms of, like if you think about film, music, like presenting ideas is really important. But we should really be saying, look, what's our alternatives and how do we build our differences within those alternatives? If you do those two things at the same time, then you are addressing both the structural and the cultural together.
Right. Found another question here. Thank you for that. This question is from Sango. In the quest of decolonizing the division among Black people all over the world, this is a long question, so
okay.
Follow me. In the quest of decolonizing the division among Black people all over the world, do you see the concept of Blackness collapsing the nationality barriers for Black people in the diaspora not having free access entering Africa without visa approach?
Yeah, so 100%. Now, if you think about something like the UNIA, or when Malcolm died, the Organization Afro-American Unity, which is essentially the UNA with slightly different, but this is a more radical version of the UNA. What they're basically saying is, look, if we all join, and if you said what's the development in 10 years, we need an organization like that mass member organization where Black people join, we pay our taxes, right? We have departments and governments, and we're planning and organizing things. And effectively, that replaces the nation state, right? If you get everybody in it, that replaces the nation state. You don't need a nation state no more. And once you have that organization, then things like borders have to, like, I just want to stress this, borders have to go. The national thing is the biggest barrier on the African continent, certainly, but not just on the African continent. That is probably the biggest barrier, right? And I remind people, these aren't our nations. We didn't make these nations. These are made up constructions of Europeans. And they confine us and they make us easy to control. Because it's easy to control Ghana or easy to control even South Africa, easy to control these little countries, but you can't control the whole continent. Africa is the only place really that has the mineral wealth, farmland. It has everything. Like, imagine Africa that's properly united. Don't need anybody else. Don't need America. Don't need the West. Don't need China. Don't need nothing. And that's why they're so scared of it. And that's why they have to keep balkanizing it. So yeah, if we do this properly, some kind of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, if you want to call it that, would have to be in place to tear down those borders. So that, and we're talking about 50-year long term what that looks like. If you're Black, you're part of the nation, so you can come in and out freely. There will be absolutely no barrier to that.
Yeah, thanks for that. You had said something in your presentation in regards to just like you talked about the Black consciousness and the necessity of us developing this Black consciousness, and it made me think about how Europeans were able to infiltrate Europe because we didn't have that Black consciousness per se. I mean, not to say, there were, of course, like places where people had cultural differences, but still, worked together and identified themselves as part of a singular group. But there was a lot of division and cultural differences. And I just think about today, like there's a push. I wonder if you see it or if it's just like, the media kind of just, making it look like it's bigger than it is. But there seems like there's this push to create more, what am I trying to say? Just to highlight the cultural differences and sort of exploit that to cause divisions among African or Black people. I see a lot of like these nativist movements. So are you seeing that?
Yeah, totally. 100%. Like you can see that. And this is why I say when the representation thing is necessarily a good thing, because a lot of it is doing that same thing, right? Like trying to highlight the difference. We're not the same, we're different, which of course, like culturally we are different. That's true. Like there's massively cultural variation. But this is why Blackness, and this is also, I think, a lot of my problem with the way that Blackness is represented mainstream, is it's almost like it's a culture. And the Blackness isn't a culture. It's a political commitment to each other that can contain all that various array of cultural difference, which is so important and so beautiful. And actually, the trick of white people, if you think about white people as a group, Like, as much as there were European empires who were fighting, they were united on white supremacy. They were supporting each other on white supremacy. They came into Africa as white people, and they dominated Africa as white people, and they battled over little bits and pieces, etc., etc., etc. But they really did. There was so much collusion between them because they understood that they couldn't take over the continent without all of them coming together, right? And our response to that wasn't to come together and say, "Well, let's organize together and fight back." And our response was to really embrace that all these different cultural differences. And this is why I stress here: blackness does not mean we have to be the same, think the same, talk the same, culturally the same at all. It just means we have to say we're on the same boat, we're going in the same direction, and we can and when we pull together. But that doesn't erase cultural difference. Cultural difference is one of the things that makes Africa so important. So even though I'm saying, look, you should have a United States of Africa, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the different cultural difference. I just say it's actually a better way to represent the cultural difference, not made up places like Nigeria, which is actually a terrible way to represent cultural difference, which is why there's so many problems anyway in the first place.
Yes. Thank you for your response. And also just want to thank you and appreciate you for joining this platform, being a part of this Pan-African conference. Being told we're going to transition, give people a break, but it's an honor to share the stage and have this discussion with you outside of just seeing you on YouTube videos.
So thank you for sharing the video. Yeah, glad they're useful.
Yeah. So we're going to transition again. Thank you for joining us. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back and give the final remarks from the African Unity Movement for Decolonization member organizations to conclude this conference. So we'll be back at 3:00. So at 3:00, meet us on the main stage if you plan on getting a drink or a bite to eat or something. But at 3:00, we're going to have the final or the closing remarks of this momentous conference.